he was really the architect of Kuwaiti foreign policy through decades, 40 years. And his stamp on Kuwaiti foreign policy is deep, real, and I predict it's going to be lasting. He became Emir on the death of Sheikh Jabir and in 2006, and has ruled these 14 years since then. He was also prime minister from 03 to 06, and the effective ruler because Sheikh Jabir was really quite ill at that time. He had an extraordinary experience in his life. You can imagine all the historical events that took place in those 40 years. He developed an enormous number of relationships, very close relationships with international leaders all around the world. This proved very important after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, when he was able to call on these leaders to speak out on behalf of Kuwait. Obviously, that support was not significant enough to lead to the Iraqis deciding to withdraw, but it was very important in building the kind of international coalition and support for Kuwait's liberation that was really critical to our success as a country in putting together that coalition. He was always focused on the defense of the country and taking actions that would best do that. He was one of the main proponents, and I would even say maybe architects, of the Gulf Cooperation Council that was founded in 1981 of the 6 Arab Gulf states. And he did so with the understanding that a unity in the Gulf was important to the security, independence, and safety of all those countries, which I will get to a bit later, because his last efforts were trying to work with the rift, and it was a great disappointment to him that he had not been able to succeed there. He's been a staunch advocate of the United States, relationship with the United States ever since 1990. He was, in fact, the Kuwaiti negotiator when the then ambassador, me, negotiated the status of forces agreement with Kuwait, which is the foundation of all of our military deployments and relationships militarily with Kuwait since then. I think all of you would understand that that relationship has been critical to our interest in the region. Kuwait was from where we launched the military intervention into Iraq in 2003. And we have, up to this day, 135,000 troops in the country. He was a tough negotiator, I might add, a really very tough one. In fact, I learned a bad lesson during those negotiations. I was under some pressure from Washington to get an answer from him on a very particular sticking point. And I unfortunately succumbed to the pressure from Washington. I called him on the weekend. Never should have done that. He was fishing, and he was absolutely livid. He chewed me out and hung up the phone. And I heard later from the Secretary General of the ministry that they were a little bit afraid I was going to be PNG'd. Never call the Sheikh Sabah on a fishing day. Well, I never did after that. Fortunately, he forgave me, and that never was a big issue. But it tells you he was a tough cookie when he had to be, and he certainly was. So I think there are 3 attributes to his legacy that I want to just briefly mention. One is that he is seen as the father of his country. Now, you can say there were lots of other emirs, and that's true, but he really was emir and the prime minister in leading in Kuwait into the modern times of post-liberation. And I think he's beloved and will remain beloved, I believe. And one of the best examples one could possibly come up with that shows his care and concern for people was after the atrocious bombing of a Shia mosque in Kuwait in 2015, in which I think 27 worshipers were killed. He went immediately to the site in spite of the security forces trying to deter him from doing so. He said, "I'm going to be with my people when they're in trouble." And he went there and he spoke to the country by news right from the site. And then he went on to something else. He opened the main Sunni mosque in downtown Kuwait for the condolence in condolences that went on subsequent to that incident. He always spoke out for the unity of the country. It's a fractious country, people know it politically, it's very active politically, but he was always one to try and bridge and mediate and moderate, internally as well as externally. And in fact, that's what I would tell you, what I think is his second legacy, and that is the role that he played over countless years as a mediator and an arbitrator. When I began looking into that, I was just astonished. He was involved talking between Pakistan and Bangladesh back when Bangladesh broke away. He was involved in an instance between Turkey and Bulgaria. There was an incident between the PNA and Jordan, which he sought intervention, his own intervention, and he managed to smooth things over. And then the civil war in Lebanon as well. He was very active in trying to bring the various factions towards some sort of resolution. And as I said earlier, the most notable of his efforts today was the extraordinary number of times over the last few years that he tried to solve this rift between Qatar on the one hand and Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain on the other. Again, he had a deep conviction about the importance of unity. He traveled amongst these countries. He brought together at a couple of points in time some of the leaders, but he never managed to reach a resolution. And I am sure that if he could say today, what is the one thing that you regret most about your life, he would probably say that I wasn't able to be successful in resolving that particular issue. So I think his death really does leave the region without anybody like him, with the gravitas, and the personality, and the experience and the connections to be the kind of mediator and arbitrator that I believe, frankly, the region very much needs. So let me turn then to the transition itself. It was smooth, without any controversy. And it also followed the Constitution. I mentioned to you that Kuwait became independent in 1961. Well, before the end of 1962, they had a constitution, which is still in effect today. And that constitution very much delineates how the emir is chosen and how the heir apparent, which is the terminology in actually the Constitution. And forgive me, I'm going to use Crown Prince today because it's a little easier for me. But it says, for example, that the emir automatically, it doesn't say automatically, but it implies that immediately becomes emir when the previous emir dies. And that we saw that happen on the 30th of September. The new emir, Sheikh Nawaf, appeared as he is constitutionally required to appear before the National Assembly to take the oath of office, which is a pledge to the Constitution and a pledge to the people of Kuwait, which he did. The Constitution also sets forth that the new emir has 1 year to indicate who he wants to designate as the Crown Prince. Sheikh Nawaf announced 8 days after he took office, which is a record. It's shorter than any other period in time. He announced that Sheikh Mashal Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah, the current, the then, I guess he was, a deputy commander of the National Guard, was his choice to be the heir apparent or the Crown Prince. He's required by the Constitution, and he followed it, to submit that name to the National Assembly, and the Constitution says he has to be approved by a majority vote. And I think that vote took place today. So this is very important because there have been times in Kuwait's history when an emir actually prorogued Parliament, set aside parts of the Constitution, but the requirement, in fact, the people, subsequent to the invasion of Kuwait, demanded from the emir a pledge, which he gave them during the exile period, that when he got back, that's Sheikh Jaber, that they would restore the constitution fully, and there would be elections to the National Assembly. And one of the things that proves to you how important Sheikh Sabah was in this period, there were numerous resignations of the government, many changes. And always there were people within the community, Kuwaiti community, who said, the Emir is not going to have elections. He's going to go back to the old way. And always Sheikh Sabah announced he was going to follow the constitution and there would be elections, and there were constantly. So my point being here is that the new Emir has followed the constitution to the letter, and that has made major satisfaction in the Kuwaiti public about their new leadership. Now, the new Emir, Sheikh Nawaf Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah, was the heir apparent during the period from 2003 to the death of Sheikh Sabah. He was not, is not a person who likes publicity or goes out and looks for media coverage or to make a big splash on almost anything. He's very quiet, pensive, yes. But I learned from my experiences with him, because he was also a Minister of Defense in Taif at the time of the invasion. I worked with him very closely then. Prior to that, he'd been Minister of Interior. So he's had a lot of experience in government. He knows what's going on. He was almost always in meetings that I had with Sheikh Sabah after he became Emir in the years that I went back to visit. And I expect, however, that we're going to see a different sort of governance with this particular person. Historically, this is interesting. Historically, up until just 2003, really, the Crown Prince of Kuwait was simultaneously the Prime Minister. And there was a calculated political reason for that, because the Constitution says that the Emir and the Crown Prince can't be questioned in Parliament. There can be no confidence measures against them. So it always protected the Prime Minister from the kind of interrogation that we've seen subsequently. This changed when Sheikh Sabah was made Prime Minister, and under him as the Emir, the Crown Prince was not the Prime Minister. There was a separate one. I'll come back to that in just a moment, because I think that's important to look at what might happen. The new Crown Prince, it was very close to the late Emir. In fact, I would share with you something I heard from Dr. Bader Saif, who is a Kuwait professor, and I was on a panel with him yesterday. He made a very interesting observation about the new Crown Prince. He says, you know, he's both an insider and an outsider. And so how can you say insider and outsider? He said, well, the insider part is that he was very, very close to Sheikh Sabah. He was often in meetings with foreign dignitaries. He was often there when the Emir was meeting with delegations from the Kuwaiti population. He traveled with him. In fact, he was the escort for the Emir when he came for his medical treatment, and he also escorted the body back to Kuwait. So he was also an outsider. And what does that mean? It means that he was simply not involved in the kind of fractious politics within the Sabah family between several senior members. He was just out of it. He wasn't a part of it. And in addition to that, he was never, ever accused or in any way involved in corruption. And both of those points have been made by private Kuwaitis as they look at the position of this new Crown Prince. And it's seen as a very positive selection. So he has a lot of credibility in moving in. Now, I mentioned a little bit about this question about leadership going forward. I think there's something to watch, and I'm not going to be able to give you a crystal prediction here. And that is, who is going to be designated the Prime Minister? Now, the new Emir right off the bat, having received the resignation of the current prime minister and council of ministers, rejected that resignation and asked him and his council of ministers to remain in office and prepare for the November elections to the National Assembly. So that tells us that there will not be any change in the prime ministry, at least in the next 5 to 6 weeks. What might follow those elections, though, is a speculative matter and could be important. The question is, will Sheikh Mashal assume the prime ministership, as was done in the past, bringing together once again the crown prince and the prime minister's position? I would tell you that in the past, there was a lot of opposition amongst the opposition in the parliament, National Assembly, to those positions being combined because it protected the prime minister from interrogation in the same way that they could when it was separated. Whether there will be a different attitude about that, given the confidence that people seem to have in Sheikh Mashal, I don't know. But I do predict this. Sheikh Mashal is likely to be much more active than his predecessor was in the position of crown prince. That's, I think, his nature. But he hasn't been flamboyant about his involvement in the past. One of the things that was very, very clear in the reign of Sheikh Sabah was that he was a hands-on emir. Again, historically, what I was telling you about the combination of the heir apparent with the prime ministry, the emir normally stayed out of the day-to-day operations of government. I remember going to see Sheikh Jabir at one point over an issue that was quite important to me and to the US government, which was the way the Kuwaitis were dilly-dallying over improving the conditions of where our military were trying to live. And he said to me in English, and his translator kind of got very excited because he was speaking to me in English, which he never usually did. And he said, "Skip, when I was the prime minister, the emir under whom I served did not interfere in the day-to-day business. But give me a little time." And he did, and it worked out. But that was the old tradition. And I think the personality of Sheikh Nawaf, who's now the emir, is far more in line with that sort of a role than certainly Sheikh Sabah. But that does call for then a very strong person, other than the emir, to be engaged in those day-to-day operations. And so will not be surprised if Sheikh Mashal took on that role, but we'll have to just see. So let me turn then to look at what lies ahead, other than just that issue of the internal governance of the country. I think again that the question that I just raised, we will know more about post-elections in November. But the new leadership, doesn't matter who is in positions of authority and who has the prime minister's position, the problems they face are enormous. The first one is very much economic. I don't need to go into the details, but all of us are aware of the fall in the price of oil, which certainly cuts into the revenue of the state. They are operating well below the revenue income, meaning that they're not getting the income that covers the expenditures. At the same time, it's very hard to cut back on the prerogatives, the perks that they've long since given their citizenry. Raising taxes is probably not going to happen at all. And there is a big need and the government has been trying to get the National Assembly to give them authority to borrow, which is something that all governments do to get through difficult economic times. The government does not have that authority now, and the National Assembly has not been willing to give it. We'll see now whether with the change in leadership and all that, that maybe in the elections, there might be a change in that attitude. The other, of course, is COVID-19. Kuwait has been hit with it in the same way every country in the world has, so that they're not able to meet as they would normally meet. They're not able to conduct business as they normally would. So both the business community and the private sector are encumbered by this, and it continues. The government has done a fairly good job of trying to control it, but they're discovering, like other countries, that trying to control it doesn't mean that you actually get it under control. And then I would say domestically, I'm speaking, these are all domestic issues, dealing with the National Assembly. It's always been extemporaneous. It's always been wild, and they love to call ministers before it. And if you can get enough signatures, you can have a vote to try to vote them out of office. The Constitution gives the Parliament, the National Assembly, that authority. And so there's always been a lot of wrangling. I think there will be a honeymoon period there, just as there is in most other countries when you have new leadership. But this is it's gonna come back, and it will be an issue for them to deal with. On foreign policy, I think there will be enormous continuity, no question about that. There's broad support, public support for the policies that they have, and I just mentioned sort of two aspects of this. They all recognize they live in a very troubled part of the world. They also realize that they are a small country, geographically and in population, with three very large neighbors, all of which they have had difficulties with in some way or another. All three of them at various times have brought pressure to bear, and it's always been difficult for Kuwait to navigate that. I can give you two quick examples. One was when the Saudi embassy in Tehran was burned. The Saudi government asked all the GCC states to break diplomatic relations, as they did. Well, that was a big bind for Kuwait, because Kuwait has 35% population that's Shia. And they also understand that having a good, or at least an acceptable relationship with Iran is vital to them, security-wise. So what did they do? They withdrew their ambassador for consultations, but they did not break relations. Then it was another one. When the Saudis went into Bahrain to support the Bahraini government in the uprisings there, they again asked all the GCC states to join by sending in troops with them. And that was also the same bind, because again, with their Shia population and the Shia Sunni issue in Bahrain, that was not the place that Kuwait really wanted to be. So they didn't send troops. They deployed a few naval vessels to patrol waters offshore. Yep, so they're deft, but they are constantly under these kinds of pressures. The very close alliance with the United States is something that all Kuwaitis see as essential for their existence, for their security, and for their welfare and independence. And so there's no debate inside Kuwait about that relationship. We have 135,000 American troops in the country. I asked the Emir the last time I saw him whether there had been any, and this was in a fairly closed meeting, there weren't any press or whatnot. I said, have you had any difficulties? I mean, have there been troubles? Because in many countries where you have the military, there can be incidents between the local population. He said, absolutely, there have been none. There have been none at all. And then still up to this day, Kuwaiti families actually invite troops into their diwaniyas and for dinners and whatever. So there's still a real recognition of and appreciation for what we did, wow, 30 years ago. And I see no indication that this is going to change at all. This US presence is, as you well know, is very important to protecting and promoting our interest in the Gulf. And so we care very much about this transition. I think we're very confident at the government levels, and for many of us who are now in private life, that relationship is going to go on. So in conclusion, just let me say that in a region that is really chaotic and where anxieties usually go off the scope when the lines are drawn, this very smooth transition of power is a very notable and worthwhile transition to be complimentary about, as was the one in Oman, I might quickly add, where the late Sultan Qaboos, who ruled for 40 years, was replaced in a very, very smooth transition, in spite of all the speculation over the decades of how it was going to be. So I think the U.S. will find the new Emir a trustworthy and loyal partner as we look ahead. I'm very happy now to respond to any of your questions. Forgive me if I talked a little bit too long, but I had lots of things I wanted to say, and I feel very, very strongly about our friendship with Kuwait and all my Kuwaiti friends. They're terrific people, and we're blessed to have such a relationship.
So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and then I'm sorting through them now. Ambassador Gnehm, one of the first questions we've got is about the normalization of relations with Israel by the UAE and Bahrain. And the question is, how do you think that affects Kuwait's current stance on the issue with Israel?
A very good question. So if there's one issue where the United States and Kuwait don't see eye to eye on, it's that question of the relationship with Israel. The Kuwaitis have always been very nationalistic and very much a part of the Arab view of Israel as having occupied Arab territory, and particularly the question of justness for the Palestinian people. Interestingly enough, of course, Arafat supported Saddam Hussein in the invasion, much to the anger of the Kuwaiti population. In fact, they kicked out most of the large Palestinian community that had lived in Kuwait for a long time. When Sheikh Sabah came into the prime ministry and then later to the emirship, and he said this to me personally, we cannot forget the Palestinians. Even though they didn't do the right thing by us, we continue to support them. And for several years, the Emir actually donated $1 million a year to UNRWA, an organization that I work with for Palestinian refugees. And so that just speaks to his heartfelt feelings about the Palestinian issue. I don't envision the Kuwaitis establishing a relationship with Israel short of some resolution of the Palestinian question, meaning some recognition of their having a state. It's just an issue that they have long been tied to. I don't think they see advantages to that sort of move, given the kind of things that we see coming out of that new relationship with the UAE, for example. So I don't anticipate them moving in that direction. And it's not going to be an issue that's going to break the US-Kuwaiti relationship, as I described it, was so important.
Thanks. Our next question has to do with the selection of a crown prince that is a close relative of the new emir. And the question is how that will affect relations among leading members of the ruling family, and whether rivalries will become increasingly more public as a result.
Insightful question. Someone knows a little bit about the internal politics that go on there, that's for sure. Forgive me, it's going to be a slightly longer answer because I need everyone to understand what lies behind that question. Mubarak the Great, one of the real founders of the current state, had two sons, Jabir and Salim, and he made them both swear that the emirship would pass alternatingly between the two branches, meaning that you didn't have, as a rule, a son succeeding father in the succession in Kuwait. It was followed mostly, but there have been exceptions to that in the past. But what happened in 2006 was that the then Crown Prince, Sheikh Saad Salim Sabah, from the Salim side of the family, someone I got to be very, very close to because he was prime minister in Taif and the prime minister the whole time I was ambassador. He developed dementia. He wasn't, when Jabir died, he was the crown prince. He became, because of what I mentioned to you earlier about the Constitution, he became the emir, but only for a number of days, because it was very, very clear that he wasn't able to go to the Parliament, National Assembly, to take the oath. And when the family asked if he could actually take the oath in his own palace, the National Assembly exercised its rights and said, no, the Constitution says it has to be here. And just quickly, that led to both him submitting a resignation and being supplanted by a vote of the National Assembly. And in those situations when there is no crown prince, which there wasn't because Sabah was prime minister, the process is that the Council of Ministers recommends to the National Assembly who they recommend to become the emir. They recommended Sheikh Sabah, and the National Assembly approved that, which again tells you how the National Assembly does have authority and does have a rule. Now, when Sheikh Sabah became the emir, he named Nawaf, who was also from the Jabir side of the family. There not being an obvious candidate to the family, because it's a family caucus, they decided to bypass those few in the family from the Salim branch, putting a second Jabir in, which led many people in Kuwait to say the Salims are out, the Jabirs will never ever give it back. And there will be many in the country that will see that this is now the third person in a row from the Jabir side of the family. In terms of internal dissensions, there hasn't been a significant dissension from the Salim side other than the normal remark. You can't forget the past and what was promised. And I can see at some point in the future, a member of the Salim branch being designated as a crown prince. But the difficulties within the family you're talking about have often been with the Jabir sides of the family. A couple of the ones who were mostly involved in those tensions were bypassed and were not selected to be the next heir apparent. And that's very telling. And it speaks to the factions that were in the family. It also means that this is unlikely to be an issue anytime soon, because one expects that Sheikh Mashal, even though he's older than some of the younger leaders in the Gulf, is likely to be around for a while. And so I think that the dissension will be a bit controlled.
We have a few questions on the importance of alliances and relationships for Kuwait. Do we know of Nawaf or Mashal's relationships with regional leaders and how those might play out?
Good question. Sheikh Nawaf has been a part of some of the GCC meetings, particularly the ones that were held in Kuwait, but he has not been noticeably active in traveling around the region. I don't think he particularly enjoys traveling. That's something I understood from other people who know him. So he does not have the personal relationships that Sheikh Sabah had. That's one of the points I made earlier. Nawaf. Nawaf will have had more contact with some of the leaders in the region, particularly in his capacity as a vice commander of the National Guard. That meant he actually did have contacts, sorry, with other GCC partners, which reminds me, I better go back to Nawaf, the current emir. When he was Minister of Interior, of course, he participated in the GCC meetings amongst interior ministers. So it's not that he doesn't know people and they don't know him. It's just that he's not nearly as engaged and active as was Sheikh Sabah.
And for a few of our listeners, the American presidential election is on the mind. Could you speak to the prospects of the relationship between the United States and Kuwait under a Biden administration, whether that might make a difference, and It also asks if you have any specific insight on Kuwait's relationship with Biden in particular.
I don't have any personal insights into that relationship, so I won't be a speaking head here on that. What I do know is that former Vice President Biden has spoken repeatedly about the need for good relations and for alliances as foundations of the way America was able to influence the world scene since World War II. And there are a number of us, I'm one of them, who signed letters and so I want to be open about that, pointing out that I support Biden, and I do so because of this issue, of the way the president has handled our relationships abroad. I think the Kuwaitis, Sheikh Sabah, has been very deft in the way he worked his relationship with Trump. When Trump invited Gulf leaders to come to Washington, he was the only head of state who showed up. And the president took note of that. And in fact, there were a number of other occasions when the administration put forward some ideas. And I'm not talking about the Palestinian question here, by the way. Sheikh Sabah and Kuwait supported them. I think an indication of the president's feelings towards Sheikh Sabah was that just before he died, he presented the Legion of Honor to Sheikh Sabah. And I think that's the first time it's been done in decades to a foreign leader. And he did it speaking about the mentoringship that Sabah had toward our relationship. Now, I want to just go on to one final point on this, and that is that the Kuwaitis have, and I've heard this from private Kuwaitis, very anxious about the president, particularly when he starts talking about all of our allies failed to provide the support for our troops, and we're not going to pay the bills anymore. They're going to have to. And the reason why they are nervous, of course, is that they fear that maybe that's going to lead the president to think about the U.S. presence in the country, when, in fact, Kuwait, under the agreement that I mentioned earlier, pays full support for all of our American presence in the country. Now, a little bit of the details may have changed, but they furnish the bases. They provide free gasoline for planes and for tanks and for cars. They actually foot the food bill, the laundry bill, the medical clinics, the costs. All of this Kuwait has paid for. And that's obvious reason. They want to contribute to the American presence and reduce the burden on the American taxpayer. But you don't ever hear Trump admit that in the case of Kuwait. I'm not sure how aware he would be of it. And that is not necessarily criticism. He's got a lot to think about. But the Kuwaitis would love to hear that they were an exception to this pressure.
We have a few questions relating to democracy in Kuwait and the sometimes tense relationship between the ruling family and the parliament, and also more broadly on the future of democracy, the future of the National Assembly. Would you just like to share some thoughts on that?
Yes, I would actually. And I've made a couple of references to this in the past. It's very interesting. The Constitution established a parliament, a National Assembly. And the Kuwaiti population sees that as a right they have in the Constitution. And the Emir doesn't have the authority to do away with it. And so when he did, back well before, a decade plus before the Iraqi invasion, he did it because he was tired of dealing with an extemporaneous parliament and with opposition figures who seemed to be taking advantage of their position and what. And so he's abolished it, and he set up something called the National Council, which was never accepted. So when the invasion occurred and Iraq was occupied, the government in exile was very concerned that there be full support of all the Kuwaitis, many of whom, large numbers of whom, were in exile, for the restoration, for the liberation, and for the restoration of the monarchy. And they were unsure about that. There was a conference held in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, during the fall of 1989, while the country was still occupied. And those Kuwaiti citizens, these are businessmen, teachers, lawyers, when they came together, they were vocal in demanding that the then Emir, Sheikh Jabir, promise that upon their return to the country, they would restore the National Assembly as it was described in the Constitution. When we got back in, one of the tasks that President Bush made clear to me, that I was to do everything I could to have elections occur for the National Assembly. There was some pressure within the family early on to try to evade or avoid that commitment that had been made, but the Kuwaiti citizens made it very clear they weren't going to. And when I'm sorry, this is a long answer, but it gives you some sense of how committed Kuwaiti people are to this National Assembly. When the government called the National Council back into session, citizens went crazy in the streets, whatever. And ultimately elections were held. The National Assembly began to meet again with its authorities. Again, I mentioned to you that there was always fear that the Emir, Sheikh Jabir initially, or Sheikh Sabah subsequently, would somehow walk back. He never did. And whenever pressed, Sheikh Sabah said, I have no intentions of abolishing or doing away with the National Assembly. I might just add one little final point. If you go to Kuwait, you'll find that Kuwait is a very, very active political situation. You can hear anything under the sun. They're very vocal, they're very active. It doesn't take long to find out what people are thinking. And what I used to hear a lot about was that awful National Assembly, they don't get anything done. And it's not so different from what Americans say about our own Congress, I might quickly add. But then if anybody tries to touch it, man, it goes overboard the other way. You can't touch it, it's our rights, whatever else. So I do think that it's going to continue, and I think it's going to continue to exercise its authority. I just might add one other thing. When Sheikh Sabah was the Emir, he was a staunch proponent of women getting the right to vote and to run for office. And even though the National Assembly had at an earlier time voted it down, under his leadership, they actually voted it in. And women have been able to vote and run for office. They've not been terribly successful in being elected to the National Assembly. There have been some. There's certainly been more ministers who are women subsequent to that legislation. But I think that indicates to you that the Kuwaitis have a very strong opinion about their rights.
We have a few questions on how you see or how you might expect the new Emir to move on issues that are a little more controversial, like the Badoon issue or the issue of corruption in Kuwait.
Well, those are two issues that I could have listed under the problems that the new leadership will face, because it's been there now for a very long time. There have been some efforts to try and deal with the Badoons. And by the way, for those of you who don't know what that means, Badoon in Arabic means without. And these are Arabs living in Kuwait that the government has never recognized as citizens, questioning their heritage, that often alleging that their ancestors came into the country from neighboring states well after independence, and therefore were not citizens and they should go back home where they came from. It's been a long time. They are not going back to wherever they came from. That's a fact. And I think there may well be a move to try and deal with the Badoon question under this Emir and with this heir apparent. Controversial, yes, but I've seen a shift over time in the direction of trying to find a solution. There have been a couple of very, very minor steps allowing them to get, for example, the medical coverage that citizens get, things of that sort. But those are very tentative, and those are not rights, right? Passports, votes, things of that sort. You mentioned corruption, huge problem in Kuwait, huge problem. And many of the individuals in the family that we alluded to earlier that had aspirations have been accused of corruption. None of it's ever been proved, but it's out there, and there is a sense that the government has not dealt with corruption, and there will be demands by both private citizens and the National Assembly members for the new leadership to address corruption. It will be hard to do, but I think it's absolutely necessary, particularly given the economic situation in the country.
We have a question about Qatar, and whether you think that the loss of Sheikh Sabah is, if it reduces the chances of resolving the Gulf Rift, or if the sides might see this as a chance to renew their discussions.
Well, I'll be kind of blunt about it. There are going to be some of the leaders in the region are going to be glad that Sheikh Sabah is not around anymore for the reasons that he was intervening and trying to get a solution. And they really didn't want that. That's part of the reason why he failed. But I don't think that his death is going to lead to any initiative on the part of anyone else in the region to try and step in right away. There are plenty of voices calling for dealing with this rift. There's pressure on some of the leaders to deal with it. There's resistance on the part of some leaders. We're not there yet. The United States has tried. It got off to kind of a rough start at the beginning, but it certainly made it clear to the important figures such as Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and to the leaders in the UAE as well, that this is undermining our interest in the region and the security of the region and their security in not being able to then confront Iran with a unified position and to deal with other issues in the region in a unified way. So I think we will continue that. I do believe that there's more likelihood that it will find some way for resolution down the road, but I don't see it happening right away.
And I see we're approaching our end time. If you have some closing remarks you want to make, or.
Sure. I guess the one thing I want to say is very personal. I have was the ambassador in a time that was really very different. As I say, living in a hotel with the Emir, the Crown Prince, the ministers. All of us ate in the main dining room of the hotel, and there was a table set up for the ministers. Then Prime Minister Sheikh Saad always had me sitting at that table. I got to know them very well in a very personal way, and they got to know me pretty well too. So when I did go into Kuwait, there was a lot of very important personal relationships that I had, yes, with the family, but also with a large number of Kuwaiti citizens. And I've gone back over the years many, many times up until the recent COVID-19, certainly every year, if not twice. I think then that what you heard me say about how widespread public support is for the relationship with the United States, you can take it, that I've heard it over and over and over again. I'm very confident about Kuwait's future, even with all of their economic issues. They love to squabble. I've decided that's a DNA for Kuwaitis. They love to complain. And you have to take it seriously, but then you also have to take it with a grain of salt. You have to kind of make a judgment. And so I guess that's what I would rest my final remarks on. But as we close, let me revert back to being director of the Middle East Policy Forum and just give you a bit of a preview of the programs that we have planned for the rest of the semester. We will be having a session with His Excellency, the Ambassador of Iraq to the United States, Fareed Yassin, to talk about the region as Iraq sees it, and sort of course, for the kinds of things that have been going on inside Iraq. We also will be having a program with the former Egyptian ambassador to Washington, Nabil Fahmy, who is now a professor at the American University in Cairo, to give us a different perspective on the region and what's going on. And then a program that we will be having in November will be former Deputy Secretary of State William Burns, who will be speaking to us about a couple of things. His view of the United States in the region today, for which he's spoken out very eloquently on many occasions, and also about the Foreign Service. I want to expand it beyond just the Middle East, because he and I both career Foreign Service, and we care very much about what's happened to the Foreign Service, what's happened to the State Department. And so that's going to be very much a part of that program. So I look forward to seeing you all in the future. We'll be getting back to you with notice of these programs closer to the dates, with details about how to join us. Thank you all again very, very much for spending this hour with me, and giving me a chance to do a bit of reflections and reminiscence. Thank you.